you know what a group of flamingos is called? That's just one of thousands of facts you'll discover on 5 daily trivia questions. Hi, I'm Mark Ellison. Join me every weekday for 5 mind-expanding questions about everything from ancient history to modern technology. Perfect for impressing friends or dominating your next pub quiz. 5 daily trivia questions. And the answer, a group of flamingos, is called a flamboyance. 5 daily trivia questions.
Hey folks, Garrett Fisher here. I need to tell you about this absolutely mind-blowing podcast, Acting President, that's been keeping me up at night. It's about James Bennett, a former governor starring in a hit Sunday night TV show about overthrowing the government, and then his actual former chief of staff approaches him to do it for real. The line between fiction and reality completely disappears when these course correction rallies start popping up everywhere. Is it brilliant marketing or something more sinister? The parallels are insane. Trust me, this is the political thriller you didn't know you needed in your life. Acting President, available now wherever you find podcasts.
Calaroga Shark Media.
Inside a temperature-controlled room in the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints, thousands of documents sit in carefully organized files. Each contains the accumulated evidence for a potential saint, testimonies, writings, medical reports, theological evaluations. Some files contain decades of work, others have languished for centuries. These are the causes that wait, the potential saints whose paths to canonization have stalled due to controversy, competing priorities, or political calculation. For every Carlo Acutis whose cause proceeds with remarkable speed, dozens of candidates remain in limbo, caught in the complex web of institutional politics that determines whose virtue receives official recognition and whose must wait for a more favorable moment. This is White Smoke, Episode 17. Heaven on Hold. Today we examine the most controversial potential saints whose causes remain active but unresolved. We explore why these figures generate such intense debate, what their eventual canonization would signal about the Church's direction, and how shifting ecclesial politics may determine their fates. This is the story of the Catholic Church's most contested candidates for sainthood, and what their struggles reveal about the institution that may or may not elevate them. No potential canonization generates more international controversy than that of Pope Pius XII, whose pontificate during World War II and the Holocaust continues to spark heated debate about silence, complicity, and moral responsibility in the face of unprecedented evil. Eugenio Pacelli, who became Pius XII in 1939, led the Catholic Church through World War II and the early Cold War until his death in 1958. His pontificate saw the murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, the destruction of much of Europe, and the subsequent division of the continent between Western democracies and Soviet-dominated communist regimes. The central controversy surrounding Pius focuses on his public silence regarding Nazi persecution of Jews. While he made general statements condemning racial violence, he never explicitly condemned the Holocaust or identified Jews as its primary victims. This apparent reticence has generated 5 decades of scholarly debate about his motives, actions, and moral responsibility. Defenders argue that Pius worked quietly through diplomatic channels to save Jews, fearing that public denunciation would worsen their persecution and jeopardize Vatican humanitarian efforts. They cite cases where Catholic institutions sheltered Jews in Rome and elsewhere, presumably with papal approval. They point to testimonials from Jewish leaders who thanked him after the war and suggest that judging his decisions without understanding wartime constraints represents historical anachronism. Critics counter that as a moral leader with unparalleled global platform. Pius had a responsibility to speak explicitly against genocide, regardless of potential consequences. They argue that his diplomatic approach privileged institutional church interests over moral clarity, and that his post-war efforts to help Nazi war criminals escape justice further undermine claims about his moral courage. The controversy intensified when Pope Benedict declared Pius venerable in 2009, advancing his cause despite ongoing historical questions. This move generated significant criticism from Jewish organizations and some Catholic theologians, who argued that canonization should wait until scholars had thoroughly examined the Vatican's wartime archives. In response to these concerns, Pope Francis ordered the opening of the Vatican Secret Archives, now called the Vatican Apostolic Archives, for the period of Pius's pontificate. These archives became available to researchers in March 2020, just before the COVID-19 pandemic temporarily closed access. Early research in these newly opened archives has yielded complex findings that resist simple conclusions. Documents reveal both Pius's diplomatic efforts to mitigate persecution and his reluctance to publicly condemn Nazi atrocities. They show a pontiff who received detailed information about the Holocaust relatively early, but struggled to determine an appropriate response given the Vatican's vulnerable position. The archival evidence presents neither the moral hero of apologetic accounts, nor the callous bystander of critical caricature, notes Dr. David Kurtzer, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian at Brown University, who has conducted research in the Vatican archives. We see a pope navigating extraordinarily difficult circumstances, with a primary focus on protecting the institutional church and maintaining its diplomatic position for the anticipated post-war period. The canonization process for Pius remains technically active but effectively paused. A verified miracle attributed to his intercession would be required for beatification, but even if such a miracle were approved, the profound historical and ecumenical questions surrounding his case would likely delay further advancement. The case demonstrates how external factors can effectively halt even the most powerful internal momentum towards sainthood. 3 successive popes have approached this case with notable caution, recognizing that rushing to judgment would damage both historical understanding and interreligious relationships. If Pius XII's case illustrates how external controversy can stall a canonization, Archbishop Fulton Sheen's demonstrates how internal church politics can create similar roadblocks despite widespread popular support. Sheen, who died in 1979, was among America's most recognized religious figures in the mid-20th century. His weekly television program, Life is Worth Living, reached millions of viewers in the 1950s, earning him an Emmy Award and making him the rare Catholic cleric embraced by Protestant America. His book sold millions of copies, and his radio broadcasts extended his influence across generations. Sheen's cause for canonization began in 2002, and by all standard metrics, it progressed smoothly. In 2012, Pope Benedict declared him venerable. In 2019, the Vatican confirmed a miracle attributed to his intercession, the inexplicable healing of a stillborn infant who had shown no signs of life for 61 minutes. His beatification ceremony was scheduled for December 2019 in Peoria, Illinois. Then, just weeks before the ceremony, the Vatican announced an indefinite postponement without explanation. Behind this surprising decision lay a complex jurisdictional dispute between the Archdiocese of New York and the Diocese of Peoria over Sheen's remains and control of his cause. The conflict originated when Sheen's body was transferred from New York to Peoria in 2019 after a lengthy legal battle. Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York had opposed the transfer, arguing that Sheen had expressed wishes to be buried in New York, though courts ultimately sided with Peoria, where Sheen had been born and ordained. The dispute created lingering tension between the dioceses. More problematic were concerns raised about how Sheen, as Bishop of Rochester from 1966 to 1969, may have handled allegations of sexual abuse by priests. While no evidence has emerged suggesting Sheen personally covered up abuse, the timing of his tenure coincided with cases that later resulted in litigation. The Sheen case illustrates how the clergy abuse crisis has transformed the canonization process, explains Kathleen Sprouse Cummings, director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame. Any potential saint who served in church leadership must now undergo rigorous examination regarding their handling of abuse allegations. This is appropriate, but creates challenges for advancing causes that began before this heightened scrutiny became standard. In June 2020, the Vatican announced that an investigation had found no impediment to Sheen's cause. Nevertheless, his beatification remains unscheduled as of 2025, suggesting continuing behind-the-scenes concerns or jurisdictional tensions. The delays have frustrated Sheen's devoted followers, who see in him an eloquent evangelist whose media savvy anticipated the Church's current digital outreach efforts. They argue that his canonization would provide American Catholics with a relatable modern saint during a period of declining religious affiliation. For Vatican officials, however, the case presents complex risk calculations. Advancing Sheen's cause might inadvertently connect canonization with ongoing abuse litigation in Rochester. Waiting allows more thorough investigation, but disappoints Sheen's substantial base of support. Sheen's case demonstrates that popular devotion, while important, is not sufficient to overcome institutional caution, particularly regarding the Church's most sensitive issue, notes Father James Martin, a Jesuit priest and editor at America magazine. The Church moves cautiously, not necessarily because it doubts Sheen's personal holiness, but because saint-making in the post-abuse crisis era requires extraordinary diligence regarding leadership decisions. If Pius and Fulton Sheen represent causes complicated by external controversy and internal politics respectively, Dorothy Day exemplifies a different challenge. A figure whose authentic holiness is widely acknowledged, but whose political witness raises uncomfortable questions about the Church's relationship to power and poverty. Day, who died in 1980, co-founded the Catholic Worker Movement, which combined direct service to the poor with radical critique of capitalism, militarism, and social injustice. Her pacifism led her to oppose American involvement in World War II and subsequent conflicts. Her voluntary poverty and solidarity with marginalized communities embodied a critique of consumer capitalism that many found prophetic but destabilizing. John Cardinal O'Connor of New York opened Day's cause in 2000, and Pope Francis specifically mentioned her alongside Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and Thomas Merton in his 2015 address to the US Congress. Her cause has advanced to the level of servant of God, with the Vatican gathering testimony and documents about her life and virtues. Yet her canonization process moves deliberately slowly, despite support from significant church leaders. This measured pace reflects both the thorough investigation typical of all causes and the particular challenges Day's prophetic witness presents to institutional Catholicism. Dorothy Day's potential canonization requires the Church to grapple with her radical economic and political positions, explains Dr. Robert Ellsberg, who worked with Day in her final years and later edited her diaries and letters. She consistently criticized the very economic and military systems that many church leaders accommodate. Her witness challenges not just secular values, but the Church's own entanglement with wealth and power. Day's pacifism extended to opposition to World War II, a position many Americans, including Catholics, found morally questionable given the nature of the Axis threat. Her critique of capitalism as inherently exploitative went beyond Catholic social teaching's more moderate position. Her willingness to work alongside communists and anarchists in common cause for justice generated suspicion in Cold War America. These positions make Day's cause simultaneously attractive and challenging for different Catholic constituencies. Progressive Catholics champion her sanctity precisely because her witness challenges systemic injustice. Conservative Catholics admire her personal piety, pro-life convictions, and fidelity to church teaching, while sometimes distancing themselves from her political radicalism. Day herself might have rejected canonization. She famously responded to suggestions about her sainthood by saying, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed so easily." This quip reflected her concern that canonization can neutralize prophetic witness by relegating it to an exceptional category rather than a universal Christian calling. Pope Francis's affinity for day suggests her cause may accelerate in coming years. Her combination of personal piety and structural critique aligns with his vision of a church for the poor that challenges both personal sin and sinful structures. Her canonization would strengthen Catholic social justice traditions while potentially alienating Catholics comfortable with existing economic and military arrangements. The question isn't whether Dorothy Day was holy. Virtually everyone who knew her attests to her profound spirituality, observes Sister Helen Prejean, herself an advocate against capital punishment. The question is whether the institutional church is prepared to elevate someone whose consistent witness against war, capitalism and nuclear weapons would necessarily challenge the church's own accommodations with these systems. More in a moment.
Feeling overwhelmed, stressed, like life's moving too fast? Take a breath, take 5 minutes, and take stock of all you have to be grateful for. I'm Olivia, and I invite you to join me for 5 Minutes of Gratitude, the podcast that transforms your outlook in the time it takes to drink your morning coffee. Together, we'll explore the power of thankfulness. From life's big blessings to its smallest joys, we'll discover how gratitude can change everything. 5 Minutes of Gratitude, because a thankful heart is a happy heart. Follow 5 Minutes of Gratitude now, wherever you get your podcasts, and let's start our gratitude journey together.
Hi, White Smoke listeners. Just thought you might want to check out our podcast, Question of Faith. We'll be talking about what it was like to attend Pope Francis's funeral and what the next papal conclave might look like. I'm Deacon Mike Hayes. I'm joined by Father Damian Ferentz. We're in the Catholic Diocese of Cleveland. Father Eric Garris was at Pope Francis's funeral. He'll be our guest, and we'll talk about how other prognosticators are sizing up the candidates who could be the next pope. Will he be like Pope Francis, or will he be the exact opposite of him? Someone's going to look pretty stupid when the white smoke appears. You can see us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
While most controversial potential saints are deceased, some living figures generate speculation about future canonization controversies. Among these, Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff represents a particularly intriguing case, a former Franciscan priest whose work in liberation theology led to Vatican censure under John Paul II, but has received renewed appreciation under Francis. Boff, born in 1938, emerged as a leading voice in liberation theology during the 1970s and 1980s. This theological movement, which emerged primarily in Latin America, emphasized God's preferential option for the poor and applied Marxist analytical tools to understand systemic oppression. Boff's writings, particularly Church, Charism and Power, criticized ecclesiastical hierarchies and advocated for a more decentralized, community-based church. In 1985, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, led by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, imposed a silencing order on Boff, prohibiting him from teaching or publishing. This censure exemplified the Vatican's broader effort under John Paul II to curtail liberation theology's influence. Facing continued restrictions, Boff left the priesthood in 1992, but remained active as a theologian, expanding his focus to include ecological concerns alongside social justice advocacy. His concept of integral ecology, which connects environmental degradation to social exploitation, anticipated similar themes in Pope Francis's landmark encyclical Laudato Si. Francis's pontificate has brought significant rehabilitation of liberation theology's core insights. The Pope has met with Boff, cited concepts from liberation theology in official documents, and canonized Oscar Romero, a Salvadoran archbishop associated with the movement. These actions have led some observers to speculate about whether figures like Boff might eventually receive formal recognition, despite their complicated history with church authorities. The Boff case raises fascinating questions about how the Church evaluates prophetic voices that were marginalized in one era, but later recognized as prescient, notes Dr. Maria Clara Benjamin, a Brazilian theologian at Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. Can someone who was officially silenced eventually be recognized as speaking authentic truth that the institutional church was not yet ready to hear? While formal canonization of Boff would be unprecedented for numerous reasons, not least that he is still living and left the priesthood, his trajectory illustrates how changing ecclesiastical politics transform evaluations of theological contributions. Perspectives once considered dangerous or heterodox may later be incorporated into mainstream church teaching, raising questions about how the church acknowledges its own learning process. Similar reconsiderations have occurred with other censured theologians. John Courtney Murray, an American Jesuit silenced in the 1950s for his writings on religious freedom, saw his positions substantially adopted by the Second Vatican Council. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a French Jesuit whose writings were banned during his lifetime, has been positively cited by multiple subsequent popes. The Church's evaluation of theological contributions evolves over time, explains Father Charles Curran, himself subject to Vatican disciplinary action in the 1980s. What constitutes fidelity to tradition can look different from different historical vantage points. The question is whether the Church has institutional mechanisms to acknowledge when those once marginalized were in fact serving authentic development of doctrine. The case demonstrates how canonization processes inevitably involve retrospective evaluation of whether individuals were ahead of their time in advocating positions later embraced by the Church, or whether they overstepped appropriate boundaries of theological development. As the Catholic Church works to reconcile its global mission with its colonial history, particularly complicated canonization questions arise regarding indigenous Catholics who died during the European conquest and colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The Martyrs of La Florida represent one such case. This cause, opened in 2015, seeks recognition for approximately 1,000 indigenous people, Spanish settlers, and priests killed in what is now the southeastern United States between 1549 and 1706. Many were indigenous converts to Catholicism, killed by other indigenous groups who associated Christianity with European colonization. These cases raise profound questions about agency, cultural genocide, and the meaning of religious conversion under colonial conditions, explains Dr. Emma Anderson, author of The Death and Afterlife of the North American Martyrs. Were indigenous Catholics genuine converts freely embracing a new faith, or victims of cultural pressure making pragmatic accommodations to European power? Can martyrdom occur when the power dynamics surrounding conversion were so unequal? Similar questions surround Kateri Tekakwitha, a Mohawk convert canonized in 2012. While her personal devotion seems well documented, her canonization process navigated complex terrain regarding how to interpret indigenous religious experience through European Catholic frameworks. More contentious are cases like the proposed canonization of Nicholas Black Elk, a Lakota Catholic catechist whose cause began in 2017. Black Elk maintained traditional Lakota spiritual practices alongside Catholicism, raising questions about whether his religious synthesis represents an authentic inculturation of faith or a compromise of Catholic doctrinal integrity. These cases forced the Church to grapple with how colonialism shaped Catholic expansion and how to honor indigenous Catholics without reinforcing problematic narratives about conquest and conversion. They also challenged the Church to develop more nuanced understandings of cultural synthesis and religious identity. The question isn't simply whether these individuals were subjectively holy, notes Sister Priscilla Solomon, an Ojibwe sister of St. Joseph who works on indigenous reconciliation. It's whether elevating them addresses or compounds the Church's complicity in colonial violence. Canonization processes must consider not only individual virtue, but also broader questions of justice and reconciliation. Pope Francis's emphasis on the Church's need to seek forgiveness for colonial abuses suggests that future canonizations involving indigenous Catholics will likely incorporate more explicit acknowledgement of these complex dynamics. Recognition of indigenous martyrs may increasingly be paired with formal apologies for historical wrongs, creating a more integrated approach to historical memory. Some of the most intense canonization politics involve not specific candidates, but competing interpretations of already canonized figures, particularly Pope John Paul II. His 2014 canonization, just 9 years after his death, represented one of the fastest elevations in modern church history and generated significant controversy about both process and substance. Critics argued that the acceleration of his cause prevented adequate historical assessment of his 26-year pontificate, particularly regarding his handling of clerical sexual abuse cases. Most notably, his support for Martial Maciel, founder of the Legionaries of Christ, who was later revealed to have sexually abused numerous minors, raised questions about John Paul's judgment and oversight. Despite these concerns, Benedict waived the normal 5-year waiting period after death, and Francis completed the canonization process. This rapid elevation reflected both genuine popular devotion to John Paul and institutional investment in affirming his papal legacy. The controversy continues, however, through competing interpretations of what John Paul's sanctity signifies. Conservative Catholics emphasize his stance against communism, his affirmation of traditional moral teaching, and his theological conservatism. Progressive Catholics highlight his social justice teaching, interfaith initiatives, and apologies for historical church failures. John Paul II has become a Rorschach test for competing Catholic visions, explains Dr. Massimo Fagioli, church historian at Villanova University. Everyone claims the saint who supports their ecclesial priorities while minimizing aspects of his legacy that challenge their positions. It's a battle over not just who becomes a saint, but what existing saints mean. This phenomenon extends beyond John Paul to other recently canonized popes. John XXIII, who convened the Second Vatican Council, and Paul VI, who implemented its reforms, have similarly become figures whose legacies different Catholic factions interpret through their preferred ecclesiastical lenses. Pope Francis's simultaneous canonization of John XXIII and John Paul II in 2014 represented an attempt to transcend this factionalism by honoring popes associated with different Catholic tendencies. However, the strategy has had limited success in bridging divisions between Catholic progressives and traditionalists. The battle over John Paul's legacy demonstrates that canonization doesn't end controversy, it sometimes intensifies it, notes Dr. Kathleen Sprouse Cummings. Once someone is elevated to the Church's highest honor, their life becomes even more significant in debates about Catholic identity and direction. This dynamic suggests that controversies surrounding potential saints like Pius XII would likely intensify rather than diminish with canonization, as different constituencies would continue contesting the meaning and significance of their elevation. More in a moment. For controversial potential saints, the canonization process involves not just evaluation of personal holiness, but calculation of institutional readiness. Church authorities must assess whether elevation would serve or hinder broader ecclesiastical objectives regarding unity, public witness, and interreligious relationships. This political dimension explains why some causes advance rapidly, while others languish, often independent of the candidate's objective merits. Timing becomes crucial. A canonization that might generate intense controversy in one era might proceed smoothly in another when historical perspective or institutional priorities have shifted. The Church thinks in centuries, observes Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagli, a senior Vatican official considered a potential future pope. What seems urgently important in one moment may look different with historical distance. Patience allows discernment to unfold with greater wisdom. For controversial candidates, this deliberate pace serves multiple purposes. It allows for more thorough historical research, particularly when competing narratives exist about the person's actions or legacy. It provides time for potentially divisive issues to be addressed through dialogue rather than forced conclusions. And it respects the reality that canonization represents not just recognition of personal holiness, but a communal statement about what the Church values and aspires to embody. This approach frustrates some who see delays as politically motivated rather than spiritually discerning. Supporters of particular causes often suspect that institutional resistance reflects ideological bias rather than legitimate concerns. Yet the politics of waiting serves an important function in allowing the Church to navigate complex historical and theological terrain without premature judgments. When canonization involves contested historical figures, waiting isn't just bureaucratic delay, it's responsible stewardship, explains Father Robert Caslin, a canon lawyer at the Catholic University of America. Sanctity involves both the individual's virtue and the Church's readiness to propose that life as exemplary for the faithful. Both dimensions require careful discernment. As the Catholic Church navigates increasingly complex cultural and political landscapes globally, several trends seem likely to shape future controversial canonizations. Recent reforms have increased transparency in the canonization process, making requirements clearer and decisions more accountable. Pope Francis has emphasized the importance of thorough historical research and honest assessment of candidates' limitations alongside their virtues. This transparency trend will likely continue, with more explicit acknowledgement of why certain causes advance or stall. Rather than obscuring controversial aspects of potential saints' lives, the Church may increasingly incorporate these complexities into more nuanced presentations of sanctity. Francis has emphasized that sanctity manifests in diverse contexts and forms, not just through traditional religious vocations or dramatic martyrdom. This expanded vision creates space for recognizing holiness in previously overlooked contexts, among laity, in secular professions, through environmental advocacy, or in interfaith bridge building. This broadening of sanctity models will inevitably generate controversy as it challenges established patterns of who receives institutional recognition. Yet it also creates opportunities for the Church to identify holiness in contemporary contexts where traditional religious frameworks may seem less relevant. As the Church's demographic center continues shifting to the global South, canonization politics will increasingly reflect tensions between Western and non-Western perspectives on history, virtue, and religious expression. Candidates revered in one cultural context may generate controversy in others, requiring more sophisticated cross-cultural discernment. The case of Pius exemplifies this dynamic from an interreligious perspective, but similar tensions arise regarding colonialism, indigenous rights, and cultural differences in understanding spiritual experience. Future canonizations will likely involve more explicit engagement with these intercultural dynamics. Perhaps the most fundamental tension in Catholic saint-making involves balancing recognition of prophetic witnesses who challenge systems of injustice with maintaining institutional stability and unity. Figures like Dorothy Day represent this tension acutely. Their elevation would strengthen the Church's prophetic voice, while potentially alienating those comfortable with existing arrangements. This tension reflects Catholicism's dual nature as both prophetic movement and institutional religion. Saint-making inevitably navigates between these poles, seeking to honor authentic prophetic witness without undermining the Church's capacity to function as a unified global institution. The most profound insight from examining controversial potential saints may be recognizing how canonization reveals not just who the Church believes is in heaven, but what kind of Church it aspires to be on earth. By elevating particular individuals as models of holiness, the institution makes statements about its values, priorities, and self-understanding more powerful than any doctrinal declaration. When we argue about who should be canonized, we're really arguing about what kind of Church we want, explains Sister Elizabeth Johnson, a theologian who has written extensively on saints. The saints we choose reflect the virtues we value and the direction we believe the Spirit is leading us. This explains why canonization controversies generate such intense passion. They're not merely historical or procedural disputes, but fundamental contests about Catholic identity and mission. When different constituencies promote competing candidates, they advocate for different visions of what the Church should emphasize and embody. As the Catholic Church continues navigating increasingly complex cultural and political landscapes worldwide, its saint-making processes will inevitably generate both inspiration and controversy. The figures it chooses to elevate, and those whose causes remain in perpetual discernment, reveal its institutional priorities and aspirations more clearly than perhaps any other dimension of its life. In the end, the politics of sanctity isn't peripheral to Catholicism, but central to its self-understanding. Through those it declares exemplary, the Church declares itself, with all the promise and limitations such declarations inevitably entail. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration.
In Washington, D.C., power flows through information. But what happens when the most sensitive military intelligence in the world ends up on the wrong phone? In the halls of power, a national security advisor makes a fatal miscalculation. On the other side of the world, a special forces team walks into a perfectly orchestrated trap. When the dust settles, 4 American soldiers are dead, 3 more captured. And the most catastrophic intelligence breach in modern history is just beginning to unravel. Signal Lost, a 6-part podcast thriller about betrayal, courage, and the devastating consequences of a world where even our most guarded communications are never truly secure. When everyone is listening, nowhere is safe. Signal Lost. Available wherever you get your podcasts.